So this is a pretty big project, and I wanted to start thinking a bit differently of how I wanted to do this. So usually my projects are just this one huge project, and it makes it a bit difficult to sometimes make packages that can be used in different projects. Like for example, if I would use an atlas, and then in that atlas I would have vegetation and some random signs or some street projects, something like that. So this time I decided to split the project into three sections: a rickshaw, vegetation, and then just the house and everything else. The reason is just because I'm thinking I could maybe put the rickshaw and some variation up on Sketchfab or 3D stores, and then I could also make some kind of South Asian urban tropical package with vegetation in time. But anyway, so I would now start with the rickshaw. Uh, and the rickshaw is a bit interesting. Like you saw that my drawing of a rickshaw and a bike was absolutely terrible, so it was kind of daunting a bit to start this process. I'm also feeling I'm always so behind in my 3D progression in comparison to everyone else, and the only way through it is actually just to let go of all of it and just continuously do stuff. But that's not how I usually work, and sometimes just having to be aware of it and accept it, that I need some time to muster the energy to make the jump and do stuff. Anyway, so one thing I did do was that I put my beach assets on Unity Asset Store. I really thought, wow, it's a great package. You really get it. You're getting like a sun chair, but you're also getting like all these cans and bottles and everything. A boombox, different bottles, and all of that. Like the best cooler box of all time. Then it was in like process for 3 months, and then it got rejected for being too simple. And I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit of a downer. I really did think it could work, um, but it just shot down all my ambitions of making modular assets to sell. But then I was like, mm, I mean, if you give up, then well, then everything is kind of lost. So why not just pick myself up and just continue? Um, well, 2 months was actually like 2 months of magic in Dota and lying in bed and crying about not being accepted in the asset store. But anyway, eventually I got to my new project where I finally decided just to move on and try making another set. And this time I'd be using my rickshaw in my bigger environment as well. So even if that wouldn't succeed, I would still be using it somewhere else. The first thing I did was to think back to my beach assets. I realized that one thing that I really did that bothered me is that whenever I did these small pieces in a scene and they were repeated, either I just have to wait until the very end and create the real instances of them, or sometimes I would forget a certain piece, and then my solution would be just to color sample part of the UV to get something similar. Uh, so now I've been dabbling a bit with trim sheets that my friend showed me, and I thought, why not create a rickshaw entirely in trim sheets? So I started mapping out the rickshaw in a trim sheet the best I could. And while I thought some things could be done like this, I couldn't really shake that some parts, like the main body of the bike, would just look better with a regular substance painting. But I really liked the sense of modularity I was getting, like the banners and stripes. If I wanted different lengths of those in regular UV mapping, they would just need different UVs, but here I could just tile them in one axis. So then I thought, why am I really thinking about one or the other? Why not combine them both? So then I started to separate the model into three parts: one conventionally textured, one using trim sheets, mostly reserved for smaller items of things with the same material but different sizes, and a third that was just a big image that I could drape a 3D model on top of. And this was mostly used for like the back of the rickshaw that always have some kind of like picture on it. That way, I would save a lot of UV space in my conventionally textured piece while quickly being able to texture my smaller pieces without losing resolution or stretching UVs. And additionally, I'd be able to vary up to different kind of rickshaws I could make. Either way, I decided it would also include some of my 2D art into the 3D piece. I gotta admit, it feels pretty funny to be able to do this kind of cross art kind of thing. Once I was done with everything, finally feeling ready to be done with the rickshaw, I felt something was off. And it was just this massive time sink hit me. So my idea here was that I would just make the material of the cover thing to be a separate material. And the idea here would just be to make that anyone could take this asset and just swap the texture to whatever fun image they wanted to. It's one of those ideas that seemed amazing in the moment. But then the issue was that when I had rusted up the bike so much, this now super pristine cover looked so out of place. Like it had absolutely no dirt or anything. And I'm just in that moment where I've already made all my variations. I've done all my lot steps and everything, and now I have to think about it. Is it worth it? Is it worth redoing all this work to make the cover look better? And while I was trying to justify that, I'm like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. No one will think about it. It just kept nagging me so much that eventually I caved. I really couldn't release something like that and be happy about it. Especially if the idea would be that I would be putting it up on a market and it wasn't really viable. But I still wanted to keep the idea that the texture should be swappable. So my first instinct here was just to vertex paint the crevices and bleed in another texture into the cover. That way I could insert whatever image I wanted wherever, and the image underneath would work. Great. So I do all of this. I set up all the new variations and everything with this in mind. But once I'm finished, I'm thinking, one, from what I know, Sketchfab does not support vertex blended materials. And two, I'm adding quite an expensive method of shading to a small object in a scene. Like vertex painting is something maybe you want to save for something like larger. Do I really want this level of complexity to a relatively small item? And with this in mind, I'm now starting to question myself, how much would someone who would want to or need to swap the texture of the cover? I thought to myself, if I bought the asset myself, would I really want all these extra layers of muff just for the possibility to change the texture of a rickshaw? And the answer to this was obviously no. Like if I just bought the asset and really, really want another texture, I could just go into the 3D program and make that change. So after all this back and forth, I finally landed on the very basic solution. Create an atlas with all the motifs that I wanted and then just paint the dust and dirt in. It's just baked into the texture. There wasn't really any need for all this extra faff or complexity. It's just one of these things that are just so frustrating to land at after you've gone through down so many paths. And then you just end up with the most old school solution. But I think it's also just fine to let your pride go and do what's easiest that keeps you going.